is in my heart. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Everybody sing. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Can't you feel it?
Hello, I'm Mike Mazzalongo, your host for Inside the Church of Christ, a program that tries to invite you, the viewer, inside the church buildings where the churches of Christ meet. Well, this week we're going to go into class, and we're going to have a special class entitled Grieving at Christmastime. You know, many people at Christmastime remember the loss of a loved one and suffer terribly through what should be a happy time. So we're going to try to help that out this week with this special class. So join us, won't you, for this week's edition of Inside the Church of Christ. We'll be right back with our class after this message from one of our sponsoring congregations.
Jesus said, "It's not those who are healthy who need a physician, but those who are sick. I did not come to call the righteous," he said, "but sinners." For this reason, sinners are welcome at the Church of Christ. For more information about the church, please contact the congregation listed here or in your local telephone directory under Church of Christ.
Holiday time of year is also a difficult time of year for many people who are grieving. It is also the time of year where the police and hospitals record the greatest number of suicides and depression. Now, this strange phenomenon repeats itself every year. As the general mood goes up, the number of suicides and doctor visits for depression also goes up. Some people say that it's because extremes at one end of the mood scale initiates extremes at the other end of the mood scale. So today, I'd like to examine this problem of grief and depression at Christmas time and how to deal with it if this is your experience or if it's the experience of someone that you love. Now, both research and personal experience tell us that people who have suffered significant loss, such as the death of a loved one, or perhaps the loss of health, or even losing a job, often find the holidays, things like Christmas and Thanksgiving, so on and so forth, the hardest time for them to get through. It seems that as the mood of people around them goes up in anticipation of the vacation or the holiday, the mood of the individual who is suffering goes down. Now, there are specific reasons for this. For example, we think of holidays as times of being together. And for those who have lost someone, these times tend to highlight the fact that they're alone. I mean, a spouse that has gone through the death of their loved one, or perhaps even a divorce, or a family that is far away, or children that perhaps have died long ago, or perhaps have moved out of the home, holidays tend to remind us of our aloneness. We're reminded because everybody else is celebrating and we're all alone with our grief and our suffering. Another reason for the hardship at this time of year is that high emotional times like Christmas tend to stir unhappy emotions along with the good ones. I mean, everybody's happy, all things are stirred up, but when you stir up emotions, a lot of times bad emotions are stirred up as well. Some people who are able to control their emotions at other times find it very difficult for them to control their emotions during the times of holidays. Another reason for this difficult time during Christmas is that the bittersweet, nostalgic feelings that we have at Christmas time naturally tend to go to Christmases past when we enjoyed other good things. You know, for the person who has had an unhappy childhood or who has lost someone that existed in the past, the backward focus of the Christmas season tends to multiply the feeling of loss, the feeling of loneliness, because all of the good things that they had were in the past, and the depression follows afterwards. Another reason that sociologists give us for this particular problem is that holidays tend to run in predictable cycles. And so people with pain and loss also have to anticipate the first Christmas without mom or another Christmas alone. You know, with time, scars tend to heal, but the cycle of holidays also become a cycle of times when the pain is more intense. So during the year, you're able to forget, you're able to cover over the scars of a great loss. But then Christmas time comes around, and it seems that everybody around you is reminding you of the loss that you have suffered. And so you fall into depression. Now, we've been taught that grieving is normal, even healthy for us. But this doesn't mean that grieving isn't painful. It may be normal and natural, but it certainly is painful. And some people, faced with the inevitable round of pain that holidays like Christmas will provoke in themselves, they buckle under and they give way to depression, or even worse, they begin to think that suicide may be a viable option, because in the end, people who commit suicide are thinking they just want the pain to stop. And unfortunately for them, Christmas time reminds them over and over again that they are in pain. Well, grieving is nothing new. It's a universal experience. Some people say that the pain caused by grief is felt exactly the same way by every person throughout history, regardless of their language or their culture or their age. You know, even the Pharaoh of Egypt, who lived thousands of years ago, grieved in exactly the same way that we do when his son was taken on the night that the angel of death took the firstborn throughout the nation. We think about Jesus, and although Jesus wasn't actually born in December, there was grief associated with his birth even then. We know the story of Herod, and how Herod had every male child under the age of 2 years killed in order to try to eliminate what he thought was a threat from this new baby king that was born. The Bible tells us of the wailing and the mourning and the grieving of the mothers at the loss of their children. So even in those days, the loss of a loved one was as painful, and it was experienced in exactly the same way as we do today. Now, if we review the lives of various Bible characters, we're going to see that dealing with grief is as old as man himself. And the way that people dealt with grief is in perfect accord with the grieving process described in modern psychology books. I've always found that very interesting. I look at the Bible characters, and I see their life, and I study the way that they reacted to pain and loss, and I realize that they reacted in exactly the same way that we do, and exactly in the same way that psychologists tell us that people normally do today. Solomon is right. There truly is nothing new under the sun. So let's look at some of these Bible characters who grieved great losses. If you want to, we can go right back into the Garden of Eden, and we can talk about Eve. She grieved for her murdered son Abel. I mean, think about that. She had to think about her son who had been killed by her other son. The Bible tells us she was silent and she was in shock. Well, we'll be back with our program in a moment, but first I want to introduce you to our guest today, Danny Mize. He's the Executive Director of the Kids Place, which is a center for grieving and families, and we'll talk about the center a little bit later on. But first of all, I want to talk about some of the problems that people have at Christmas time. What are some of the misconceptions that people have about grief in general?
Well, in general, I guess people will sometimes put a time frame on grief and have the feeling that after a certain number of weeks or months that a person ought to be over it, as we sometimes hear, and that grief is the same for everybody, that you ought to go through certain predictable stages, and all of that is really not true. Everybody grieves in their own way, on their own time frame, even within a family. There are differences between men and women and children in how they approach grief.
I see. This being the Christmas season, are there any special problems that children have at Christmas time with grief?
Children who are grieving, I think, are affected by the adults. Grief sometimes takes so much energy, emotional and physical, away from the adults that the children are often neglected in their grief during the holidays. And I guess I would encourage people to really give special attention to the children. Let them have their holiday. Even if we don't feel like it ourselves, we may have to surround ourselves with some other friends or relatives to help the kids have a good time, because children don't grieve all at once. They grieve periodically. And so they may want to play a while and then be sad for a while and reflective and then back to playing again. A little different than adults, but we need to recognize that and give them whatever traditions we can during the holiday times.
Mm-hmm. Good advice. Perhaps we could expand some of that advice and talk about not the people who are grieving, but the people who are helping the people to grieve, family members and friends. Any suggestions for, the helpers?
Well, several. I would say, first of all, be sensitive to the needs of grieving people. Don't be rigid with them and try to force traditions during the holidays. We may feel like it's best from our standpoint for us to do the same things the same way, and we've got to be flexible during the holidays when someone's experienced a loss. I mean, if they had been involved in a traumatic car wreck or the house had burned down, we'd give them a lot more flexibility than we often do when they're grieving. And so allow them to pick and choose, to be involved in the holiday traditions as much as they are emotionally able to be involved.
Good. Well, we'll go back to our class session for now, but we'll come back with Danny a little later on. We'll give you some information about the kids' place. So here's a message on one of our sponsoring congregations. We'll go back to the class, and we'll see you in a few moments. Thank you very much. Let's look at some of these Bible characters who grieved great losses. If you want to, we can go right back into the Garden of Eden, and we can talk about Eve. She grieved for her murdered son Abel. I mean, think about that. She had to think about her son who had been killed by her other son. The Bible tells us she was silent and she was in shock. And according to the Bible record, she only breaks her silence when God finally gives her another child who would grow to be righteous. She acknowledges that God gave her Seth to replace Abel. Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. And then we look at Job. Everybody knows the story of Job. Job displayed pretty good control despite his terrible losses, but eventually his anger at God began to seep out. His accusation was similar to many who have been hurt by severe tragedy, and he accused God of not being fair. Have you ever heard that one before? You suffer something that is terrible, and you think about it, and you hang on to your anger, but eventually you cry out to God, this is just not fair. Well, Job did that, the very same thing, thousands of years ago, and the Bible records it. How about David? David and Goliath, David who wrote all the Psalms. David suffered great anguish at the deceit of Absalom, his beautiful son. The Bible says Absalom was a beautiful boy, and David really loved this boy. But David was in major denial. I mean, even though his son deceived him and his son tried to take the kingdom away from him and even tried to have David killed, David was still trying to save and protect his dear son Absalom. And he never really acknowledged his treachery. Here was a man who was in total denial. Sound familiar? Happened thousands of years ago. What about Jeremiah, the great prophet? He saw and he warned about the impending destruction of Jerusalem, but nobody listened. And his book of Lamentations is a long and bitter account of his grief and tears over this event. And Jeremiah spent much of his time in depression. You see the pattern here? Anger and denial and depression. These wonderful people, these men of God, these prophets suffered exactly in the same way that you and I do when facing terrible tragedies. And in the New Testament, what about Paul, the great apostle Paul? He tried to bargain with God. Isn't that the word we use? He tried to bargain with God in continually asking God to remove the thorn in his flesh, the problem that was denying him some sort of objective, and he kept bargaining with God. And Jesus himself, our Lord himself, prayed to have his suffering removed from him, but to no avail. We witness him finally accepting God's will. There's that word, acceptance. Jesus finally accepts God's will for him in going to the cross, but not before intense prayer and intense emotion that caused drops of blood to fall from his forehead. So you see, I repeat over and over again, it's nothing new. These experiences of grief, these experiences of denial and bargaining and anger and depression, and then finally acceptance were things that human beings suffered and the Bible recorded thousands of years ago. Well, I don't want to end the lesson here just saying to you that, well, you're grieving and you're hurting and so what, everybody else feels the same way. I don't think that's very helpful. So I want to talk about how God helps with grief. Our suffering never goes unnoticed by God. Whether we are in Israel 3,000 years ago or we live in modern America during Christmas time, our suffering never goes unnoticed by God. God cares about our pain and our sorrow, and He provides help to deal with these things, whether we are suffering at the point of impact, when the loss occurs, or at the reminder stations like Christmas and other holidays. God cares all the time. And so here are some of the ways that God helps us with our grieving at Christmas time or at any other time of the years. And I want to list these for you so that you might be able to remember these things the next time that you are suffering some depression. First of all, God provides His constant love. That's a wonderful thing for someone who is depressed or someone who is grieving. The loss of a loved one is really the loss of the love that was exchanged between that person and ourselves. That's the thing that hurts so badly. We can never again regain that love. The joy that we lose when someone we once loved leaves us either through death or divorce, or when something we loved to possess or use is lost to us. Many times we lose our health, and that causes us to grieve as well. Now, the only answer to this is to accept the fact that love is no longer there. The love of a partner or the love of a child or the love of a feeling good and strong has left us. We don't have a choice. Sometimes we just have to accept that that love is gone once and for all. We can, however, focus our need for love on the love of God for us that never leaves us and will always be the same. Jeremiah talks about this in Jeremiah chapter 3, verse 32 and 33, and I'll read that passage for you. Jeremiah says, "Though He brings grief, He will show compassion, so great is His unfailing love. For He does not willingly bring affliction or grief to the children of men." That's Jeremiah chapter 3, verses 32 to 33. God does not send grief. God does not send sorrow. He allows us to suffer. Yes, that's true when it comes. He permits us to suffer. But He is not the one that sends the grief, that sends the pain, that sends the suffering. No, what He does is He sends us His love when we are suffering. Paul, the apostle, in Romans chapter 8, verses 35 to 39, describes all of the things that have no power to separate us from God's love. What a great passage this is to remind us of how much God loves us. He says, "Neither trouble nor hardship, nor persecution, nor famine, nakedness, danger, war, death, life, angels, demons, the present, the future, the powers that be, nothing in all creation," he says, "can separate us from God's love in Jesus." These things bring grief. These things take away our loved ones. But none of these things can extinguish God's love for us. When the grieving is intense, we need to make the special effort to recognize God's continuing love for us in providing us help and life and food and all the resources that we need for our constant support. These are all signs of His uninterrupted love. And we need to stay focused. I get away from my notes for a minute. We stay focused on the bad things. We replay the accident over and over. We replay the treachery over and over in our minds. And we wonder, why am I suffering and why do I feel bad? Instead of refocusing our lives and our attention on the good things that are constantly there. I tell myself sometimes, hey, I'm breathing. My eyes work. My teeth work. I start with the little things, and then I move up to the big things. I still have a family. I still have people who love me, and so on and so forth. Well, another thing that God does for us, especially those of us who are grieving, is that He comforts us directly. You see, grief is like a heavy coat that just kind of comes over us. It's like a burden. It's like a heavy stone, and it seems that someone's put a heavy stone right onto our hearts. Or it's like a huge wave that overwhelms us in sorrow and depression. Some people have described grief like this. You know what? Jesus said, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted." Matthew chapter 5, verse 4. And David said, "But you, O God, do see trouble and grief. You consider it to take it in hand. The victim commits himself to you. You are the helper of the fatherless." Psalm chapter 10, verse 14. Now, in these passages, God, in the direct way that He can, is the direct helper and comforter of the person who is sad. You see what I'm trying to say? God reaches directly into our lives and helps us directly, person to person. We like to pray, "God, please work through the hands of the minister, or work through the hands of the doctors and nurses, or work through your servants to heal us." And that's a good prayer, because God does work in those ways. But you know what? Sometimes God works directly to help and to comfort, to support, and to heal us. You know, he can do anything He wants. He can use the doctor, or He doesn't have to use the doctor. He can go right through all of those things, all of those intermediaries, and reach right down into our heart and heal our hearts and make us feel better if He wants. And I think sometimes that doesn't happen because we just don't ask Him to do these type of things. Jesus promised the apostles that He would send the Comforter, not only to help their memory, but also to help them in difficult times, to give them the right words to say when they were persecuted. Luke chapter 12, verse 12, He guarantees them that they shouldn't be afraid. He'll provide the words that they need when they're attacked. And also, He sends the Comforter to comfort the church in times of difficulty and in times of change. Acts chapter 9, verse 31. Of course, God gives this comfort to the Christians who trusts in God's ability and willingness to deal directly with His hurts and sorrow. You know, I believe in God's direct ability to lift my sorrow. I mean, I really believe that. I really believe that God can reach down inside of my heart and lift the burdens off of my heart. I believe that He can and that He will do that, and that He has done that. All that's missing at times is for us to believe and trust in Him and ask Him in prayer. You know, it happens not only because of the pills, and not only because of the meditation, and not only because of the counseling and the exercises. I mean, those things are good for us. But sometimes it just happens suddenly.
Hi, this is Arnelius Crenshaw with the Northeast Church of Christ. We would love to have you come and worship with us. On Sundays, we meet for Bible study at 8:30 a.m. Morning worship is at 9:45, and our evening worship is at 6 o'clock. We meet for midweek Bible study at 7:30 on Wednesday nights, and remember, you're always welcome at the Northeast Church of Christ.
Well, I'm back again with Danny Mize, the Executive Director of the Kids Place, and this time we're going to talk about the Kids Place, the Center for Grieving Families. Danny, thank you for staying around and visiting with us. First question I have to ask is certainly about the Kids Place itself. How about giving our viewers a little history of that particular center?
Okay. Well, the Kids Place is a support group center for grieving children and their families, children ages 5 through teenagers, and their adult family members. And we started after the bombing. Several of us have been involved in support work with grieving adults for years, but had never really focused on the children. The bombing really caught our attention and made us realize that there are so many children out there with all kinds of losses that need a place where they can go. And what we try to do is create a warm, safe environment where they can share as much as they want to, or as little as they feel like they need to, about their grief journey.
Okay. Who supports it? I mean, how did it begin?
Well, I came out of a church ministry background, and we established the Kids Place as an independent, community-based charity, and we gain support from churches and individuals and businesses. We do some fundraising, but we really are trusting for the donations to make it happen because we do not charge the families. The services of the Kids Place are free to the families.
I see. And is it only for families who are members of the Churches of Christ?
Not at all. We're open to anybody from anywhere in central Oklahoma, regardless of race and religion and background. And we've had such a wide variety of people. It's been really rewarding to see the response of the communities. To date, more than 300 individuals have been through our program, and we've only been open 2 years.
That's amazing. How about giving some specifics now? Location, phone numbers?
We're located in Edmond, but as I mentioned, we've had families from all over. I think 17 different communities to date. But the people just call us to receive an application packet. Our number is 844-KIDS or 844-5437. And we would send them a packet of general information about the Kids Place and specifically a family application packet. After going through that, they would call us for an interview, come to Edmond, tour our little center, watch a videotape that just takes 3 minutes, but it lets you hear from some of the kids who have been a part of the Kids Place, and then decide if they want to be a part of the program. Then they're assigned to a particular night. We've got 4 sets of groups going right now.
Great, great. A wonderful ministry. And if you missed the phone number, if you're looking around for a pencil, it's okay. If you need the information on the Kids Place, simply call the Choctaw office, and we'll be happy to provide you with all the information that you need. And if you have any questions, any comments that you'd like to make, of course, you can always call our church office or dial us up on the website, and we'll be happy to communicate with you in any way we can. I also mention at this time, if there are elders or deacons or members of the Churches of Christ who are watching this program who would like to participate inside the Church of Christ, simply call our office. We'd be happy to come out and visit with you and explain to you how you can participate in this program. Well, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for being with us. Dial us up next week, same time, same station. We'll see you then. God bless you.
If you would like copies of this week's lesson on audio or video cassette, please contact us at telephone number 405-390-8732, fax number 405-390-8730, or visit our website at www.insidechrist.com. This program is produced by Media Missions for the Choctaw Church of Christ, Choctaw, Oklahoma. Call 405-390-8732 for times of worship or other information.
Oh, heaven is in my heart. 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 Everybody sing. Oh, heaven is in my heart. Can't you feel it? Oh, heaven is in my heart. The kingdom of our Lord is here. Heaven is in my heart.